Within a few months, I'd come home from work and I'd find Jane in her room crying. I'd find our daughter in her room crying. And Jane said after a while, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I signed up for. I never wanted to be at war with my kids. To my knowledge, we'd never met a homeschool family. I never heard of homeschooling. I didn't know homeschooling was even an option. And somehow my wife heard about it. Jane, I don't know where she came across the concept. And she said, what would you think? Now, this conversation ought to sound familiar because I think many of your listeners and your viewers have had this same conversation. She said, what would you think? I mean, just hypothetically now, what would you think if we were to take the kids out of school and teach them at home? And that's how it begins for most of us. And it's usually prompted by the Holy Spirit and things that we swore we'd never do, we suddenly find ourselves exploring. And so my first question was, is that even legal? And my second question was, I didn't know the word socialization back then. Nobody taught me that word. So I said, how will my kids have friends if they're not in school? And so we talked about it and I prayed about it. And I felt like the Lord said to me, you want your kids to have friends? I said, yes. And he said, and you're convinced that being around lots of other kids makes friendship. And I said, right. And I felt like kind of, not audibly, you know what I mean? I just felt like the Lord said to me, I can hear the prayers tonight of thousands of people who are surrounded by people, but who are so lonely tonight that they're considering suicide. Mm. Friendship is not a result of being around people. If you want friends for your children, ask me. I'll send them friends. Friendship is a gift from God. And so we began that journey. They'd been in public school. Our oldest daughter, not our youngest, our oldest had been in public school for a year, then a private Christian school for a year. And then we made the decision to begin homeschooling. And so that was in 1981. And within a few months, I'd be less than honest if I didn't tell you. And Jane always kind of cringes when I say this, but it's true. And she knows it's true. Within a few months, I'd come home from work and I'd find Jane in her room crying. I'd find our daughter in her room crying. And Jane said after a while, this is not what I wanted. This is not what I signed up for. I never wanted to be at war with my kids. And I think we should maybe just throw ourselves in the mercy of the school board and re-enroll them. But as she prayed about it, she felt like the Lord said, why don't you read to your kids? And she said, oh, I do, but how do I teach them? And he said, why don't you read to them? And she said, well, I do. We read aloud a lot, but how do I teach them? And he said, why don't you read to them? And so on that note, she kind of changed everything she was doing because we'd found used textbooks at garage sales and old history. I think the first history book we ever found was published in 1943, and we got to the end of it, and it didn't tell who won World War II, and so we were kind of distressed by that. But so she
said, "Do you know now?"
Yeah, I do know now. I do know now. So she kind of set that all aside, except for math and spelling, and she began reading. And out of the reading time came all sorts of joyous discoveries, because within the pages of books are treasures about history and about personalities and about courage and about dealing with our fears and about geography and about foreign culture and food and music. And so together they began exploring. And out of that, oddly, several years later, as our kids began to grow, several girlfriends came to Jane and said, I'm ashamed to admit this, but I find myself in my room crying most days and my kids in their room crying, and you seem to have a great experience. What do you do? And she said, well, you just read to them. And they said, what do you mean read to them? And so she said, well, you read and you talk about what's in the books. And they said, well, I don't get it. And so she wrote, as a gift to some girlfriends, some lesson plans for some of her favorite early childhood books, and said, here's some things you could talk about, and here's some things you could do, and meals you could cook, and places you could explore. And that became the very first incarnation of what's now known as 5 in a row unit studies, which have been used, I think, by 600,000 or 700,000 children over the last 30 years in about, 60 different countries. But it all began really kind of at the bedside Bible college of homeschooling, because, and I think this is important, because there weren't any choices back then. There wasn't any homeschool curriculum to choose from. Textbook publishers wouldn't sell. We contacted several Christian textbook publishers and they wouldn't sell to us because, and this is my surmising between the lines, but I think because Christian schools said, if you sell to homeschoolers, then they don't need us and we will stop using your curriculum. So they refused to sell to individuals. But as time went by, the industry grew, and now mean, I'm proud to be part of the industry that's a multi-billion-dollar industry. But I think it's actually harder for new homeschoolers today than it was then, because then all we knew was the Lord had told us to do it. And so we had to figure it out. And today, I think if you walk into a typical homeschool convention and you see 600 vendors
Yeah.
with over 100 math programs and over 100 phonics programs and over 100 history programs, it's just pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I will sometimes say to Jane, what would you do if you walked in today as a brand new first time homeschooler? And she said, I think I'd turn around and walk back out again. So, but over the years, we've watched it grow. And now we're in the third generation because our kids are grown. My daughters are now 40. Well, I'm not going to say, but they're well into their 40s. And so my oldest grandchild's making plans for an upcoming wedding. And so I have
Wow.
7 grandkids from age 7 to age 22, and they've all been homeschooled. And so I think moms need to hear that your kids aren't going to grow up to be freaks. Oh, I mean, they might if you're a
Right.
freak, but not if they do, it won't be because of homeschooling. And
Right.
so we're now seeing third generation homeschoolers, and we know now thousands and thousands of them, besides our own children and our grandchildren, and discover that they're leaders in their community. They find their place within the community. They've developed their gift set through the medium of homeschooling and the opportunities that are abundant there that are missing in a classroom setting, where they have time to pursue their gifts and their interests. And wherever they seem to go, they immediately, almost without exception, it seems, to become leaders in whatever community they find themselves in. And I think parents who are just starting this journey need to know that that's the outcome. I read a survey not too long ago about a small private college, I think in the Carolinas, if I recall, and they had 3,000 students, and of the 3,000 students, they had 90 who had been homeschooled, so 3%. But of the 12 elected leadership positions among the student body, so advisor to the dean, senior class president, advisor to whatever,
Mhm.
11 of the 12 were homeschool students,
Oh, wow.
recognized by their peers as being leaders in the university community. So it's scary. I mean, this is a scary thing. If you foul this up, your kids and your grandkids are going to come home and live with you forever because they're never going to be able to get a job. So we're frightened when we start this journey, but it's now a well-traveled path with lots of proven results. And our family is just one of millions of families that have seen the fruit that grows, and the fruit that grows from homeschooling is sweet. And
Yeah.
especially when it's a decision born out of faith. Decisions born out of faith bear sweet fruit. Decisions born out of fear, not so much sometimes. Sometimes that can be bitter. So we encourage people, don't choose homeschooling because you're afraid of violence in the classroom or because you're afraid of godlessness in the schools, because all those are real. I mean,
Right.
those are things to be concerned about. But the reason to choose homeschooling is because the Lord's put that desire in your heart, and you move forward by faith, going, you know what, Lord, I don't have all the answers, but I'm trusting that you knew I was terrible at spelling when I was in school, and you've got a plan, and I'm trusting you for that.